Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Parkinson's disease is on the rise. It's being called a slow motion epidemic, one with no cure. Today we ask what's causing this rise. At the same time, researchers are talking about Paraquat, one of the most widely used herbicides in America. Farmers use it to kill weeds and dry vegetation, making harvesting easier. These researchers say there's evidence associating Paraquat exposure to Parkinson's, while at the same time, the EPA and other big reviews conclude the evidence is just not there to establish that direct link. Sound familiar? We've heard all of this before in several circumstances. Today, we'll speak with one of the nation's leading Parkinson's researchers, as well as with someone who's living with the disease after he says he had been exposed to Paraquat for decades. But zooming out, the story of Paraquat and Parkinson's gets at something larger. What happens when science and data don't always support those signs and clues and signals and, yes, someone's painful lived experience? How do you make the best decisions for society amid scientific uncertainty? And is that even the right question to be asking? Let's find out. Hey, welcome everyone. We have a really important episode today. I'm really excited for our two guests. Dr. Ray Dorsey, a leading Parkinson's researcher, is here, and Stephen Brandenburg, who was a videographer and who worked in the fields on behalf of, different agricultural companies. He says he was exposed to Paraquat over the years through that work and now has Parkinson's disease. So we are so pleased to have the opportunity to speak with both of them. But first, who the heck are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdimalik.
Yep, and this is Why Should I Trust You, which is both about the breakdown of trust in health and medicine and how, through collaborations, we might be able to bring some of that trust back. And as always, big reminder, you can ping us at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net.
Okay, so as we've said, we have a chock-full show today with two phenomenal guests. But Tom, help us get our head around the basics of Paraquat.
Yeah, so let's start with how Paraquat works to kill a weed, and it goes back to photosynthesis. So when sunlight hits a weed and it starts converting that light into energy, there's electrons that circulate inside the weed cells, sort of like a current. Enter Paraquat. It slips in, hijacks those electrons, and turns them toxic. So instead of stimulating growth, they are now destroying the plant from inside and quickly. And, in the end, this process of photosynthesis, which is meant to give the weed life, is instead used to destroy it. So Paraquat is rolled out in the 1960s. It's now widely used on American farms to kill weeds, which is obviously this is a major tool used by farmers. It's also used to dry out some crops to actually make them easier to harvest. And it's not approved or used on residential land or golf courses. The EPA warns it can be deadly if ingested. They literally say one small sip can be fatal. And the EPA restricts, how it is applied. It's natural for people to immediately think about the food in their grocery cart. Like, is this affected by Paraquat? At this point, there's no clear evidence showing the same type of risk from typical everyday consumer food exposure. The research we're discussing is focused almost entirely on the people with much higher levels of exposure, primarily the agricultural workers who handle these chemicals directly, and in some studies, the communities that are right up against these large-scale farms.
Yeah, Tom, I think you make an important distinction. This isn't something that you can get at your local hardware store or big box store to help you with your garden. This is a commercial farming tool. But before we can really tackle the tension between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease, let's just get a handle on the basics of Parkinson's. What is it? Many of us, of course, know the disease through Michael J. Fox's inspiring story. We've all seen him and heard about him talk about it. He has a great foundation researching a lot of this around Parkinson's. But very likely, and unfortunately, you also probably have a family member, a friend, or neighbor who lives with this condition. And what it is at a high level, it's a movement disorder of the nervous system and it's progressive. So it worsens with time. So we think of tremor or shaking as the defining feature of the disease. That's what everybody kind of knee-jerk responds to when they see it. And eventually that tremor shifts and causes stiffness, and we get slowing of movement. There's the characteristic walk. And, in medical school, we're all taught about it, and it has a name. It's called the shuffled gait. But what's happening is that your brain is slowly losing control of your body's movements. And those are the symptoms we see. And if you're living it, unfortunately, the ones that you feel, it can affect your speech. And then there are non-motor things too, right? So there's like things like trouble smelling, or you start to have problems with memory or thinking. And there's even in dermatology, there's a facial rash that we see much more common in patients with Parkinson. So what is happening on a cellular level? The nerve cells in your brain, remember those are called neurons, they start to break down and die. So remember, those cells were the ones making the chemical dopamine in your brain. And without the right amount of dopamine, with those nerve cells dying, basically, your brain activity becomes irregular. And that irregular brain activity with dwindling dopamine levels is why we see what we see. So the signals are getting, messed up, really. Tremors, stiffness, just moving more slowly. And it can be really hard to watch a loved one in decline with Parkinson's. Now, there are a lot of medications that can help with the symptoms, but unfortunately, there's no cure. And so there's also other things that can be done besides medications. You can have surgery, you can have deep brain stimulation, certain exercises and therapy can all help with the symptoms.
Yeah, and here's the stunning thing. Parkinson's is the fastest growing neurological disease in the world. Researchers say cases have doubled in just the past 25 years. Here in America, the disease affects an estimated more than 1.1 million people, with about 90,000 new cases diagnosed each year.
Yeah, I mean, it's stunning. And it really begs the question of, well, what causes this? And just like in a lot of things, the honest answer is, well, we just don't know. Now, there are some specific genetic changes linked to Parkinson's, but the genes can't really explain the majority of Parkinson's. So we know that only about 20% of Parkinson's cases are tied to a genetic cause. That leaves the vast majority of it being, something else. So what else is it? Here it is, the good old quote unquote environmental factors is where scientists and researchers are spending a lot of time now when it comes to Parkinson's to try to tease out these details. You're talking about research around exposure to toxins, like what we're going to talk about today, or other environmental exposures playing a role in the disease. And the fact that we can't find this strong genetic cause has also pushed researchers into a new way of thinking about it. Is it kind of like a cumulative thing? Is it like your lifetime exposure? Is it a little bit of pesticides? Or is it industrial solvents, like things like used in dry cleaning? Is there a head injury component? Is there inflammation? All of these vague symptoms. But keep in mind, the problem with this kind of theory is that it's incredibly difficult for science to untangle. It's not easy to do these kinds of experiments to get us the scientific certainty that we want and that often we require to act. So remember, we're exposed to countless environmental factors over decades, but the scientific picture is not clear cut, but there are some strong signals. A 2011 NIH funded study found that people with occupational exposure to Paraquat were 2.5 times more likely to develop Parkinson's. Now, that has helped fuel years of research. Remember, this is back 2011, years of research into Paraquat as a possible environmental risk factor in Parkinson's. There was a 2019 meta-analysis of studies, and that concluded that there is a statistically significant association between Paraquat exposure and Parkinson's disease. And they said basically further study was warranted. Now, if you look in the medical literature, sometimes we just want like an update about what's happening. And every few years, the New England Journal of Medicine or any big journal says, okay, well, let's just do a review article on this topic. There's been a lot of science. Let's go back and take a look and kind of update the literature. I found this article fascinating. It was a 2024 review article in the New England Journal of Medicine. It said, quote, residential or occupational exposure to pesticides, and they list a few, one of them including Paraquat, or chlorinated solvents, has been associated with a dose-dependent 40% or greater risk of Parkinson's disease in most studies. So yes, this is in the New England Journal of Medicine, a recent article, a review kind of saying, this is what we know. But notice the language they say associated with, which, as we've talked about a lot on this show, doesn't mean that a causal relationship exists. And then there was a 2024 study by UCLA in which researchers looked at California farm workers. And Tom, you took a look at that study, right?
Yeah, in that study, they analyzed more than 800 Parkinson's disease patients to 800 people living in the same counties who do not have the disease. And these researchers wrote the Parkinson's disease patients both lived and worked near agricultural facilities applying greater amounts of herbicide than the community controls, and that the study provides further evidence that Paraquat exposure increases the risk of Parkinson's disease. So the other side of the coin, the EPA, they say, quote, there are many studies on Paraquat and Parkinson's disease that range in quality and provide conflicting results. The agency goes on to state, quote, after a thorough review of the best available science as required under law, EPA has not found a clear link between Paraquat exposure from labeled uses and adverse health outcomes such as Parkinson's disease and cancer. There was another big review. California regulators recently conducted a review of studies on these links between Paraquat and Parkinson's and said they came to a similar conclusion as the EPA, writing, quote, overall, there is limited but insufficient epidemiological evidence at this time to conclude that there is clear associative or causal relationship between occupational Paraquat exposure and Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, Tom, and in some ways, this is kind of similar to the early studies that and scientific debates around smoking and lung cancer. Researchers saw this strong pattern and growing evidence long before we could explain every biological mechanism or prove causation in individual cases. And for smoking, it took decades to connect back to the risk of developing lung cancer.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the parallel there. And there's just a couple of recent developments that we need to talk about before we bring in our guests. So facing thousands of health-related lawsuits, a big supplier of Paraquat in the U.S., that's Syngenta, entered into a settlement agreement in 2025. In January of this year, Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA, announced, quote, EPA is requiring Paraquat manufacturers to thoroughly prove that current uses are safe in real-world conditions. If they cannot meet that standard, decisive action will certainly follow. In March, that same company, Syngenta, announced they are stopping production of the herbicide in June, citing competition from many generic makers of the product. In an online resource page, the company says Syngenta rejects the claims of a causal link between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease because it's not supported by scientific evidence. Despite decades of investigation and more than 1,200 epidemiological and lab studies of Paraquat, no scientist or doctor has ever concluded in a peer-reviewed scientific analysis that Paraquat causes Parkinson's disease. We'll talk about it with our guests. Hundreds of other companies, though, make the herbicide. And finally, there is some political momentum we have to talk about. Vermont's state legislature, in a bipartisan vote, has just become the first in the nation to pass legislation to end Paraquat use in the state. This comes as 12 other states are taking up bills to ban or restrict it.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, this really reminds me of the conversation around glyphosate and, what happens when there's this experience that folks like Steve Brandenburg is having, and then there's all these reviews and studies that are seemingly, not able to find that causation, and is causation really the threshold that we should be looking for? So anyway, coming up next, we are going to be speaking with Dr. Ray Dorsey and Steve Brandenburg. We'll be right back. All right, we are so excited to welcome our guests today. First off, we're joined by Dr. Ray Dorsey. Ray is a neurologist and one of the country's leading researchers on Parkinson's disease. He's the director of the Center for the Brain and Environment with Atria Health and Research Institute, an initiative focused on the environmental causes of brain diseases, including Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. He's a prolific researcher with over 200 peer-reviewed papers and is the co-author of The Parkinson's Plan, A New Path to Prevention and Treatment. Ray, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
And next, we're joined by Steve Brandenburg. Steve worked for 30 years as a producer on a video team in the agriculture industry. He described spending time in farm fields where the herbicide Paraquat had been sprayed, as well as instances where it was actively being sprayed. He has since been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He's now retired, but hosts a podcast called The Secret Life of Parkinson's, which he describes as a way to let others with the disease know that they are not alone. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Steve, I'd like to start with you and ask you to tell us a little bit about your work over the years filming in those fields and about your diagnosis. Tell us your story.
The earliest I think I can remember, we were driving in Alabama shooting a best practices video for Paraquat and cotton. The first rule is for an aerial application, you never fly perpendicular to the road. You always fly horizontal to the rows of cotton. And we were in our rental car, and we saw this crop duster going across the road. And we were crossing, he was about 70 feet ahead of us when he crossed the road, spraying fully what I'm sure was probably Paraquat. And then when we drove that 70 feet, we got our entire rental car glazed with Paraquat. And we looked at each other and it's like, did we just see that? I mean, it's crazy. And I mean, to us, you can put all the labels you want on a package about the best practices, but it's the end user that has to use it and has to actually do all that.
Tell us a little bit. So you're a videographer or a producer, and I mean, what kind of time were you spending out in these fields, and what was your actual exposure to it?
Over 30 years, I wish I'd kept a log on how many grower interviews we've shot in 30 years, but we figure on the average of 45 interviews a day using a 6-day work week with a growing season of 80 days, and I'm very generous on that. And so we had to shoot between 400 and 500 interviews with growers in different fields with different crops and different maturities. So how many of those fields have been sprayed with Paraquat the day before our interviews? It's hard to say, but I'd say there had to have been several.
I remember you telling us that you had this rental car that you washed and that you'd never washed a rental car before.
There's a first time for everything, right? Yeah, we actually took a rental car in and washed it and humbly dropped it off at the lot, hoping that its next user will be a little more gentle with it.
Because it got sprayed, right?
Got sprayed big time, yeah.
And tell us a little bit about when you were diagnosed and when you kind of started to put two and two together.
I was diagnosed on September 13th in 2018. But I'm actually convinced that I presented symptoms probably 5 or 6 years earlier than that with loss of smell and constipation. But I was in a neurologist's office and he just bluntly said, "You have Parkinson's." And I didn't hear a word he said after the word Parkinson's. It was like I was lifted out of that room. And we sat in silence for quite a while. And finally he says, do you have any questions? And I said, what am I going to do? You know, I know nothing about this. And he said, well, you just need to make the best of every day. And he said, I'm going to put you on Repinerol and I'll see you in 6 months. And he walked out the door. So Judy and I, we were sitting there for just a while. And she said, come on, let's go home. And because we had to catch a flight to Louisville, I was invited as a guest to the National Farm Machinery Show. And for years, they put a video that I produced with Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA as the music for it. And it's farmer-oriented and 6 or 7 combines in the field. It's beautiful footage. So that night they flew me in and Lee in because he was actually going to sing in person as the song played. And it was a great night. The Coliseum was packed up and they just went nuts when Lee Greenwood actually walked out on the floor. And all I could think about is I have Parkinson's. I mean, that ruined what would have been a magnificent night for me and my wife. So the next day, I went home, dropped her off, packed another suitcase because I had to go to Charleston, South Carolina, where we were staging a meeting down there for about 400 people. And I got in the ballroom down there. Things are going well. My phone rang, and it was an old friend of mine. And he said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm doing great. How are you doing?" And he said and there was silence for a few seconds. He said, "I asked, how are you doing?" And that's it. I couldn't hold it anymore. I found my technical director. I says, "I'm going home. You run the show." And I went down in my room and I just wept. And I honestly don't remember how I hung up from Daryl, the guy that called me, but it was bad. You know, when you've heard of diseases but you don't know really anything about them, you feel so helpless until you gain some knowledge about it. And for me, the next 30 days, they were just a blur. Then I finally got in touch with, I still have the piece of paper. It says exercise lady -Melissa. And she changed my life. It's PD Next Steps is a group, an organization that's just for Parkinson's people. And it seemed like everybody's in such a good mood when I was there. I was the only one moping around. 30 days later, I drank the Kool-Aid and I was just as happy to be there as everybody else. But now I work 6 days a week, and it's not bouncing beach balls at each other, sitting in wheelchairs. It's Marine camp, boot camp kind of stuff. I'm living the life. I've had 2 DBS brain surgeries for my control of my tremors, and I'm pretty happy.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing that story. Ray, I know we're going to talk about the science, but I just want to ask you, what is it like for you as a doctor to walk into that room and to deliver a diagnosis of Parkinson's to someone?
Well, 250 people are going to hear the words, you have Parkinson's disease today in the United States. And we need to take a moment and think and recognize the courage that Steve is demonstrating. It's really hard to have Parkinson's disease. In the words of Michael J. Fox, it sucks. It's really hard to be a spokesperson at face for people with Parkinson's disease. So when people like Michael J. Fox and Brian Grant and Davis Finney and Larry Gifford and Steve Brandenburg do that, we need to applaud them and recognize them. And it's really hard to reflect on thinking that, a job you really liked might have had you exposed to chemicals that are responsible for your disease. And so people like Steve will change the course of Parkinson's disease. Not only, he can't undo his Parkinson's disease, but he's going to prevent thousands, if not millions of people from getting this disease in the generations to come. And so when I see people in clinic, it's hard, but that's what we do. I mean, it's like journalists interview people in war zones. I mean, this is just kind of what you do. I'll say, though, more recently over the last few years, when I see people with Parkinson's disease, I get pissed off because I think the vast majority of Parkinson's disease is preventable. Just like Steve, if you weren't exposed to a weed killer that over 70 countries had banned, I don't think he would have Parkinson's disease. The genetic contributions to this disease are small. Only about 13% of Americans carry a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. Said another way, 87%, the vast majority don't. If you put a mouse in a laboratory and you let it age, it will never spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease unless you manipulate its genes or expose it to toxic chemicals. This is an unnatural consequence of aging. And the sooner we recognize that it's an unnatural and preventable disease, the sooner we create a world without Parkinson's.
10 years ago, Melissa had 12 people in her gym for PD Next Steps. Today, there are 130 people, and the vast majority have been diagnosed with early onset. That's scary.
Wow.
Ray, one thing that struck me is that you said that Parkinson's disease may be preventable. When we think about, and I'm not a neurologist by any means, but I think about these neurologic diseases, I think there's a part of me as a doctor who deals with the public that is just like, like Michael J. Fox said, this sucks. I mean, it sucks. People get this stuff. They get Alzheimer's, they get Parkinson's, they get MS. But you saying it's preventable is a head scratcher for me. Tell me more about why you think it's preventable.
Well, I think we all recognize that diseases have causes. Diseases have causes. And then if you say that's true, that's a central tenet of Western medicine, then one of the key things that physicians should be doing is trying to figure out why someone got a disease. And diseases are not permanent fixtures of humanity. It turns out that lung cancer in 1900 largely did not exist in the United States. It was so odd that, according to the historian Robert Proctor, that when doctors encountered a case, that they and the students would gather around thinking they would never see it again, a once-in-a-lifetime oddity. But in the early 1900s, cigarettes were introduced to the United States, and 25 years later, you'll see a corresponding rise in lung cancer, and Americans stopped smoking in the 1970s. In 25 years, you see a corresponding decline in the disease. When Dr. Parkinson described the condition in 1817, he said, I'm describing something that's not in the medical textbook. He described 6 people on the streets of London with the disease. 1800 London, there's 1 million people, 1 million Londoners. 5 to 10% of them were over 60. About 1% of Americans over 60 have Parkinson's disease. If that were true in 1800 London, that would have meant upwards of 1,000 people had Parkinson's disease. He described 6, and he said that no one else had described previous cases. I think he's describing a new disease, just like lung cancer is a new disease. Diseases are not permanent fixtures of humanity. Diseases come and diseases go. And we've seen that with polio. We've seen that with typhus. We've seen that, even in our time, peptic ulcer disease. We figured out that was not due to stress, but it was due to a bacteria. And almost no one's dying of bleeding ulcers anymore. The principal causes of Parkinson's are not inside of us. They're not in our DNA. They're not in our genes. They are outside of us in our environment. If we take action to reduce our exposure or eliminate the most toxic exposures, including weed killers like Paraquat, other pesticides like chlorpyrifos, dry cleaning chemicals, and reduce exposure to outdoor air pollution, we just create a world without these diseases. Parkinson's is largely a man-made disease. For the vast majority of people, is a preventable disease, just like it was likely for Steve.
So you're busting up a lot of, I think, assumptions that maybe we make, just everyday people make about Parkinson's, and the genetics was one that you've just told us, like, it's there, but it's tiny, it's a tiny factor in terms of like explaining this. I think the other one that I'd love to just get your sense on, I know you talk about it in your book, is that this is just a natural part of aging, that this is just part of aging. Older people, this happens.
So I think the reason we're uncomfortable with it, like, why is Mark uncomfortable? Quite frankly, why was I uncomfortable with it? Is because we were in medical school, and we were taught that Parkinson's disease was some combination of bad genes, natural consequence of aging, word about bad luck, and maybe a sprinkling and quick mention of pesticides. And that's what we were taught in medical school were the principal causes of Parkinson's disease. And I think that's largely all wrong. As I mentioned, you put a mouse in the laboratory and you let it age, it will never spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, only if you manipulate its genes or expose it to toxic chemicals. In 1826, John Adams, age 90, is writing letters to Thomas Jefferson, age 83. They're both clear as day. Neither has Parkinson's disease, neither has Alzheimer's disease. These diseases were all described, many of these neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, ALS, dementia with Lewy bodies, not described until 1976. Dementia with Lewy bodies, which felled the great Robin Williams, was not described until 1976. All these diseases have been described in the last 200 years. And that's in contrast to diseases like seizures, strokes, migraines, which have been described for centuries, if not millennia. You can find stories in the Bible that depict people with likely some of these conditions. These other neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS, dementia with Lewy bodies, these are all likely products of the Industrial Revolution. They all, with this notable exception of Alzheimer's disease, have really only small genetic contributions to the disease. Single genetic causes of all these diseases are extraordinarily rare, way less than 10%. The vast majority of the rise of these diseases are due to chemicals in our air. These are certain pesticides in our food, dry cleaning chemicals in our water, and outdoor air pollution. If we eliminate or reduce these exposures to these chemicals, we get rid of the disease. And I'll give you examples. If Parkinson's was just a natural consequence of aging, you would expect that the map of the world adjusted for age would have a uniform rate of Parkinson's disease. But it's not. Areas of the world that are most industrialized, the US and Canada, have 5 times the higher rate of the disease as they do in sub-Saharan Africa. Areas of the world that are that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like China and India, have the fastest increasing rates of disease. And countries like England, which have banned Paraquat and have got rid of some of these most toxic pesticides, and Western Europe nations that have gotten rid of trichloroethylene and have cleaned up their air, you see that the incidence of Parkinson's, the number of new cases of Parkinson's adjusted for age, in England is either flat or declining. And the Netherlands is either flat or declining, and Germany is just declining. We are already seeing the early signs of the fall of Parkinson's disease in countries that have gotten rid of these most toxic chemicals. Parkinson's now is still one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases because countries like the US are allowing Paraquat to be sprayed, not only sprayed, but sprayed in increasing amounts on farms of corn, soybeans, cotton, and vineyards. We're allowing dry cleaning and degreasing chemicals to still be used in dry cleaners in all states except for California, that these class of chemicals are associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's, and in the laboratory reproduce the features of the disease. I'm not sure what additional evidence we want. If we know that a chemical reproduces the features of the disease in the lab, as we know for Paraquat, if we know that farmers who work with it have 150% increased risk of the disease, if we know people who simply live or work near where it's sprayed have a doubling of their risk of the disease, and we have people like Steve who are courageous enough to share their story about exposure to the chemical and are developing the disease, I'm not sure what additional evidence we would want before we want to take action to prevent future people like Steve from being exposed to these chemicals and developing a disease, and in some cases having a faster rate of progression if the exposure is ongoing.
Hey, Ray, go back to what you just said about farmers and the higher risk. So are you also seeing that ag workers have more Parkinson's than the rest of the population?
Yeah. I mean, Dr. Caroline Tanner in 2011, who's a Parkinson's specialist like me, has a PhD in epidemiology from Berkeley, showed that farmers who work with Paraquat have 150% increased risk of developing the disease. Dr. Beata Ritz, an epidemiologist at UCLA, and her colleague, Dr. Kimberly Paul, showed that simply people who aren't working with the chemical, not like it, but simply live or work near where Paraquat is sprayed, have a 100% increased risk of developing the disease. Dr. Debbie Corey-Schlechter, one of my colleagues at the University of Rochester in 1999, she and her colleagues showed that you expose rodents to Parkinson's disease, they move around less. And when you look at their brains, they have fewer of these dopamine-producing nerve cells in their brains. Carrie Gillum, working for The Guardian, wrote an expose because farmers in California who developed Paraquats started to sue the manufacturer. And she looked at the evidence that the manufacturer turned over. It turned out, according to The Guardian, that a manufacturer of Paraquat had exposed mice, rats, and rabbits to Parkinson, to Paraquat, and they developed features of the disease, including a tremor in their paw. And when they looked at their brains, they had fewer dopamine-producing nerve cells. They did those experiments in the 1960s, 30 years before academics had reached the same conclusion about the toxic effects of Paraquat. People like Steve and people that I've met across the country, a woman in South Dakota whose job as a teenager was to hold up the flag to tell the crop duster where to dump the pesticides to develop Parkinson's disease. A man in Fresno came after me after I spoke, and he says, "I know how I got Parkinson's disease. I used to dump Paraquat as a pilot over fields in California." We have the evidence. The question is, are we going to continue to let people like Steve suffer with Parkinson's disease, or are we going to take action to stop people from getting this terrible condition?
I'm going to read you a quote, Ray, which I know you've read probably 100 times. After a thorough review of the best available science as required under law, EPA has not found a clear link between Paraquat exposure from labeled uses and adverse health outcomes such as Parkinson's disease and cancer. Why then, after your compelling case, of all these signals and signs and linkages, why does the EPA not agree?
Well, that's a great question for the EPA. I can tell you that over 70 countries, including China, have banned Paraquat. England's one of the biggest, is a large manufacturer of Paraquat and doesn't allow it to be sprayed on the British population, but exports it to the United States. 13 states have now proposed legislation to ban Paraquat. These states are red and blue. They include, I believe, Missouri and Utah. Vermont, I think last week, the legislature passed what would be the first bill to ban Paraquat in its state. We've seen all this before. This is not a new story. Rachel Carson in 1962 wrote Silent Spring about the indiscriminate use of pesticides. In her book, she said that new kinds of illness would appear among farmers that would puzzle the doctors in the cities. I mean, she even tells us essentially that diseases like Parkinson's are going to appear among farmers because we're indiscriminately using pesticides. Paraquat's considered one of the most toxic weed killers ever created. It kills the weeds that glyphosate doesn't. It's been used to commit homicide and suicide. So many suicides were occurring among farmers that, as countries like Singapore, I believe, banned the chemical. When they banned the chemical, suicide rates among farmers decreased in these countries. The EPA's own website says one sip can kill. The EPA's own website says one sip can kill. So it's a really good question to the EPA as to why this hasn't been banned. They could ban it tomorrow. And if they did, they would stop sowing the seeds of future cases of Parkinson's disease. And we would see future cases of Parkinson's disease. The United States did decline years from now in the future.
Steve, I want to get to you in a second, but Ray, before we move on from this, I think I need you to go back to Tom's question and help us pinpoint the issue. The EPA is saying, I know you said it's been banned in so many countries, and we did, we hear that, but the EPA says it reviewed the science. They did not find a clear, causal link. Help us understand, are you saying the EPA has misread the science? Are they looking at old science? Are they, underestimating the amount of exposures? Are they just saying
is the bar too high?
Is the bar too high?
Never going to be proven.
What is it? How can you say what you're saying and the EPA saying what it's saying?
Maybe we should ask what evidence you would want to have. So in medicine, we love the randomized controlled trial. Do we want to randomize 5-year-old kindergartners to get exposed to Paraquat and have other 5-year-olds not get exposed to Paraquat and then see 50 years later who develops Parkinson's disease? I think we've seen it. You're asking me to say why a regulatory authority has failed to ban a chemical. Regulatory authorities have failed in the past. I mean, we still allow trichloroethylene, a degreasing chemical that's associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. It was banned in 2024 by the EPA, years after other countries have banned it. In 2025, that ban was frozen. The fate of that ban is still a little bit unclear to me. I'm not a legal or regulatory expert, but we're still allowing a chemical that contaminated marine-based Camp Lejeune, where Marines who served there had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's because they were likely drinking in this chemical in their drinking water. And 34 years later, they had an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. Regulatory authorities have failed in the past. There's no reason that they can't fail now. And I think fundamentally regulatory authorities, which are, part of the political structure, respond to political pressure. If people hear the story of Steve Brandenburg, which is incredibly credible, I think they should be asking their representatives, why are we still allowing this weed killer to be sprayed on fields of corn and cotton in almost every state in the union?
Ray, I think sometimes about conversations that our show we've had with some farmers as well. And it's interesting because, we've talked about glyphosate on the show numerous times. And I just want you to help me think through and navigate something that I bet you think about a lot, but I really struggle with, right? Which is there's 3 buckets I kind of put this conversation in. There's Steve, who's got his experience and he's sick, and there's this exposure, and that is Steve's story, right? Then you've got the regulatory agencies, and you've got, the people who are like, the science just isn't there to support, and the dose makes the poison. And in this case, the dose is not going to be harmful to human health. And then you've got the economic part of it, which is you've got farmers who are like, you guys are having this great conversation, but you're going to take this tool away from us. And the truth is, we're out here trying to feed America, Are we setting up false zero-sum conversations when it can be a both and? Or do you think necessarily somebody's going to have to sacrifice something in order for someone else to gain something else? So help me with this.
These are all just myths. Listen, we banned DDT. We have no one's dying of starvation. 70 countries have banned Paraquat. More people in the world are dying from too much food than from too little food.
So you don't really buy the sort of agricultural worry that to remove these, what they call crop protection tools, is not really going to impact their bottom line or their business or their livelihood. I'm not even going to say bottom line. Farmers are going bankrupt. There's farmer suicides, things like that. Like, just put yourself in their shoes for a second. What is your best faith argument in that situation?
Listen, I'm not a farmer. I'm a product of suburbia. I know almost nothing about farming, but we have heard the same theme over and over and over again. When Ralph Nader said we should put seatbelts in cars because we take better protection of eggs and cartons than we do humans in cars, it said it was going to bankrupt the automobile industry. When we said we should get rid of lead in gasoline because 95% of kids in my generation had unsafe levels of lead in their blood, it was said that engines were going to knock and it was going to be impossible to do so. We got rid of lead in gasoline. Today, children have 95% lower levels. Children are 3 to 4 IQ points smarter because we got rid of lead in gasoline. In the 1980s, we were worried about CFCs, which were creating a hole in the ozone layer. The industry said that, people aren't going to be we need CFCs because we need hairsprays and deodorants. We got rid of CFCs and hairsprays and deodorants. The world did not spin off its axis. The ozone layer closed. In the 1960s, the air quality in California was so bad that the governor of California said we should ban unnecessary driving. That governor was Ronald Reagan. We adopted stricter emission standards. More people drive more cars, more miles in Los Angeles. The air quality is 50 to 90% better than it was, and the economy has never been better. You've heard from social media companies who say that their tools are going to help foster connectedness among teenagers. If you take them away, we will lose that connectedness beyond them. The Wall Street Journal reports on its front pages that those companies knew about the toxic effects of their products and hid them from the public, and we now have a mental health crisis among teenagers. The story is old, it's tired, and it needs to be put to bed. We've heard it time and time again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
You got a quote in your book which gets at this bar of scientific proof, and it was from a British American tobacco scientist. And he said, "A demand for scientific proof is always a formula for inaction and delay, and usually the first reaction of the guilty. In fact, scientific proof has never been, is not, and should not be the basis for political and legal action." Just explain what you read in those words.
Listen, if you're seeing resistance, that's the definition of progress. The definition of progress is that you're encountering resistance. And why are you encountering resistance? It's because I think some of these companies know about the toxic effects of their products and they want to hide them and conceal them. If your product is safe, why do you need to argue to politicians to get immunity for the use of your chemical? If it's safe, it should not be an issue.
Steve, I imagine your gears are going. You just heard Ray talk about the 70 countries that have banned it. You heard Ray say this is a man-made disease. You've heard the EPA's position. You heard what Tom just said about, the bar that needs to be, often proven before we have a policy change. Do you just what are you thinking right now? If you live somewhere else, would your life be different when you hear these lawmakers? Just tell me what you're feeling now that you're hearing this discussion.
Well, I can confidently say that I do not have the hereditary traits for Parkinson's. I'm the first one in my family to ever had it. I talked to a genetic counselor, and I didn't even have any of the markers that they were looking for to start Parkinson's. So the only thing that's left is the environment, you know?
Does this discussion, is this bringing you closure? Is this opening up wounds? Hearing a doctor like Ray talk about the associations?
Well, a little bit. I'm also concentrating on taking my life and making the best out of it and whatever I can do, and that's helping people. Yeah, it'd be nice if we had a cure sometime in my lifetime, but it'd be even better if we had a cure for the vast majority of people that are going to come after me.
I think that people will be moved by what you're saying, that even though you've been through all this, you're looking ahead. Are you part of, I know there are thousands of lawsuits. Are you part of any of those? Do you have any pending litigation against any of the companies? You mentioned the one company.
No, none. First of all, I think those type issues die on the vine, and I'm not sure if any of them ever recover anything that's meaningful to the people who are part of those suits. So I'd rather just pick up my drumstick and start beating my drum, walking in another direction to share what we've found as far as exercise is medicine. It's maybe even better medicine than the carbidopa levodopa that I'm going to take here in about 15 minutes.
Steve, what do you want to say to people who've tripped across this podcast and maybe have just received the diagnosis that you received years ago? What would you want to say to them?
Everybody has a different story when it comes to their diagnosis. Some people are relieved because they knew something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what. And others were just utterly devastated. And I was kind of in that column there. But I can say, I wanted my children to brush up on the Heimlich maneuver. And I had somebody, the doctor's nurse came out and showed me a wheelchair that I may want to be looking into one of these days, but not right now. But that's been 8 years ago. The disease is marching on quietly in my body. I'm doing things to counteract it. Everybody has a story of diagnosis, and they just need to band together, get into an organization that have other people like them, and exercise.
Ray, I imagine you've seen patients like Steve, and like Tom said, they could be listening, and here's what they're going to hear. The EPA is saying it doesn't. You're looking at the same body of evidence. You're coming to a very different conclusion. And now we have, the show's going to end, and you have the average person listening to this. How should they think about acting when there is uncertainty? And I guess I don't even want to call it scientific uncertainty, because you've already told us it's not scientific uncertainty. I think the one thing that maybe you and the EPA can agree on is that it would be unethical to conduct a randomized controlled clinical trial. But how do people leave this conversation?
So I think we have to say, like, why is it so uncomfortable? You're an outstanding dermatologist and you're like uncomfortable with this conclusion. I think we all have looked at the world from a wrong paradigm. You and I, we came of age in the genetics era, and we were told that diseases largely had a genetic underpinning, and that if we found the genetic underpinnings of disease, we would be able to treat them. And it's true. We in our era, my mentor was the late Dr. Ira Schulson. He was part of the group of people who went to remote part of Venezuela called Lake Maracaibo every year for a decade, and to identify what was the genetic cause of a rare neurological disease called Huntington's disease. And they found the genetic marker in 1983, the genetic cause in 1993. And we thought we'd find the genetic cause of disease, we could get a better treatment. And Francis Collins, who used to lead the NIH, he was part of the team that found the genetic cause of cystic fibrosis. And he said when he led the Human Genome Project, we're not only going to find the genetic underpinnings of rare diseases, we're going to do the Human Genome Project, and we're going to find the genetic underpinnings of common diseases, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. But it turned out we did the Human Genome Project in a monumental accomplishment, but we found out the genetic underpinnings of many of these common chronic conditions is very modest and very little. The principal causes of diseases that are increasingly common can almost by definition not be genetic. If something's getting increasingly common, it largely can't be due to our genes because our genes generally don't change that much in that short period of time. Diseases have causes. And I think what you're hearing from the public, what you heard on Capitol Hill with the March of People versus Poisons, is that they find that there is something unnatural about 1 in 31 8-year-old American children having autism. That has never been the case before. There is something unnatural about soccer players and young women developing ALS. There is something unnatural about Parkinson's being the world's fastest growing brain disease. There is something unnatural about 1 in 3 85-year-old Americans getting Alzheimer's disease. This has never happened before in human history. It has never been the case in the history, in the 200 to 300,000 years of humans, that brain diseases are the world's leading source of disability. And they don't know exactly why it is, but they're suspicious of chemicals that are in our environment are contributing to this. It should not be terribly surprising that pesticides, some of which are designed to damage the nervous system of insects, should have untoward consequences on the nervous system of humans. This is not terribly surprising. It should not be terribly surprising that if we allow pesticides to be sprayed on kids' schools and playgrounds, that perhaps intellectual disabilities might follow from that. It should not be terribly surprising if we spray pesticides routinely on schools, soccer fields, and baseball fields, that people might be absorbing some of those fat-loving pesticides through their skin and might be increasing their risk of ALS. It should not be terribly surprising if we cloud our air with air pollutants, that people breathing in some of this pieces of little dirt and soot that are often combined with metals might be breathing in chemicals through our nose, through the front door to our brain, leading to pathology in our smell center. Loss of smell is one of the earliest features of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, and that people might be setting themselves up for a neurodegenerative disease in the future. Diseases have causes. If we find out what the causes of these diseases are, we create a world where these diseases are increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. And if you already have these diseases, just like if you already have high blood pressure, if you already have type 2 diabetes, it is not too late to modify the course of that disease. If you stop getting exposed to pesticides, you may be able to slow your rate of progression of Parkinson's disease. If you stop getting exposed to air pollution, you may be able to slow your rate of progression of Parkinson's disease. These diseases are far more modifiable and far more preventable than any of us, including me, ever thought.
Ray, just one final thing on this. And is it possible there's a middle ground here that, like, I read the statistic about like 10% of Parkinson's is genetic, and then I read 13%, and then I think as high as 20%. But I think we can all agree that the vast majority is not genetic. Is the middle ground here that, like, in a genetically susceptible person, there's this environmental exposure and it's not so absolute like you're describing?
Yeah. So listen, there's not a middle ground or anything. There's just truth. So the vast majority of people exposed to any chemical, whether that's cigarette smoke, asbestos, or Paraquat, do not develop the disease. Only 15% of smokers develop lung cancer. Only 5% of people working with asbestos develop mesothelioma. There must be additional explanations about why some people develop the disease and why some don't. I don't know what the answer is, but I'll give you 3 thoughts. I think one is due to the exposure. What was your dose of exposure? What was your duration of exposure? How were you exposed? I think for Parkinson's disease, chemicals that are inhaled or ingested, but especially inhaled, are especially concerning. And when you were exposed, I think the seeds of these diseases are planted early. If you're exposed to a certain amount of chemical, that obviously has a much bigger impact if you're 2 years old than if you're 20 years old or if you're 2 weeks old. The second are interactions. So I absolutely right. There are genetic differences in humans, and some of these genetic risk factors. For example, the most common genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease is mutations in a gene called GBA. People who carry that mutations in that gene and are exposed to pesticides have a heightened risk of developing the disease. And just like you and I differ in the way we break down or metabolize medications, you might break down a medication really well, and I may break it down more slowly. There'll be differences in the way we break down pesticides. And so we know individuals who break down pesticides more effectively are likely to be at lower risk for developing the disease. And then I think there's just some element of chance or bad luck. And then finally, I think there are modifiers. As you age, your ability to clear out misfolded proteins, which are implicated in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, decreases. Stress can make things worse. Other diseases like type 2 diabetes may make people more susceptible. So it's clearly a complicated picture. But the central tenet is if you don't get exposed to these chemicals, you are highly unlikely to develop the disease. If you don't smoke a cigarette, you are really unlikely to develop lung cancer. If you're not exposed to asbestos, you are very unlikely to develop a mesothelioma. And if you're not exposed to Paraquat, trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, or substantial amounts of outdoor air pollution, you are highly unlikely to develop Parkinson's disease.
Boy, I'm a little speechless after this conversation with both of you. One thing I'm hearing from you, Ray, and it's an undercurrent in a lot of our episodes, which is what are we afraid of, right? When it comes to the action you're talking about, we've clearly, and I think what's interesting too, because you're really helping me challenge myself, and it's uncomfortable. You're absolutely right. Challenge myself in the conversation of, well, is the evidence there to prove something, right? And on the one hand, you've, explained stuff that's really persuasive. To be fair, we don't have anybody here representing the EPA or anybody here representing farmers in that way. And they might have a different perspective, but I don't know, on some level, we're setting ourselves up for inaction. I think that's what I'm hearing you say. And I just, in hearing somebody like Steve and his story, I just want to thank you so much for being so brave and vulnerable and speaking with such courage and just clarity on what happened with you and how you're leading your life and what you hope your legacy is. And so first, I just want to thank Steve Brandenburg for coming on our show. We're really honored that you shared your story with us, Steve.
Thank you.
And Ray Dorsey, just a brilliant Parkinson's researcher. We just want to thank you so much. We would love to have you back, both of you. But Ray, I think you're gonna make a lot of people think after this episode. So Ray Dorsey, thank you so much for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
My pleasure, and an honor to be with Steve. And thank you very much for having us both.
So that was our episode today of Why Should I Trust You? Please send questions and comments to questions@whyshouldItrustYou.net. Please sign up for our Substack. Please leave a rate, review. And we will put some resources in our show notes for folks who want to learn a little bit more about Parkinson's and Paraquat. And I am Brindata Kari. He's Tom Johnson. She's Maggie Bartlett. He is Dr. Mark Abdul-Malik. We will see you right back here next week.